You've come to the right spot. It's another edition of Lewis at Large. 60 minutes of smart talk radio is in your future, with guests from all walks of life and all points of view. And now, with this week's edition of Lewis at Large, here's your host, Warner Lewis.
Welcome, everybody, to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck. And, of course, some more Smart Talk Radio is in your future. This segment, no exception. We're going to be talking to Stephen Pimpare. He is a interesting individual indeed. He's an adjunct professor of social work at Columbia University. He has a new work out called A People's History of Poverty in America. That sort of sets the stage here a little bit for what we're going to be talking about. He has some very strong opinions about the lines and demarcations between the haves and the have-nots in the country, amongst other things, and we are very happy to have him here. Stephen, how are you, my friend?
I'm very well. How are you doing tonight, Warner?
Well, we're good. Question for you. A People's History of Poverty in America. Has there ever been a time when that has not been a hot button?
I think the fair answer is probably not. I mean, it's something that not only in American history has always been contested. We've always tried to figure out how it is that we want to identify need and whose responsibility meeting that need is. And we've always argued about those questions. I think there are some moments in American history where we've had a bit more agreement on those questions, and those have historically tended to be the moments of crises. So in the 1930s, while there was, make no mistake, an awful lot of objection to an awful lot of the programs of the New Deal, there was a much broader willingness on behalf of elected officials and the American public to allow government to come in and to offer assistance when the private market had failed, when people's own individual economies had failed. And arguably, we saw a little bit of that in the 1960s around the War on Poverty programs. Again, I think we should be careful because I think we can sometimes look at those eras with some rose-colored glasses and forget how even at those moments of extraordinary expansion of the American welfare state, there was still extraordinary opposition.
Stephen, I'm curious, interesting quote from you, or paraphrase at least. It says, poverty is not a policy problem, it's a political problem. Share with our listeners what you mean by what seems to be a very subtle difference there.
Well, if we think about, one of the things that I teach is policy, and a lot of that is, how do programs work, how do they function, where do their fundings come from, how are they administered, how are they structured, how do we think about program design in ways that deliver the best kind of services to the greatest number of people for the least amount of money, et cetera, et cetera. That's what I'm thinking of when I'm talking about policy problems. And we can, for example, we can look around the rest of the world. We can look at other rich democracies, and by and large, every other sort of post-industrial, what are sometimes called advanced economies, has a lower rate of poverty than we do, right? They figured out a way to achieve not only lower rates of poverty, but sometimes radically lower rates of poverty. And they've all done it in different kinds of ways, and some with more success than in others. But one of the things that I think tells us is that it is not necessarily this impossible, mysterious conundrum that I think sometimes people think of when you talk about poverty. They say, it's so difficult, it's so complicated, and well, even the Old Testament itself tells us that the poor ye shall always have with you, right? I think that sort of is one way to push against that sort of notion. It's like, well, wait a minute. All of these other countries have figured out how to do it. Surely we could too, and that brings me to the second place to look. And that is, of course, our own history. So if we look at the official poverty data released by the census last week, it shows an overall American poverty rate of 15%. We've sort of been stuck there for about 3 years now, about where we were in the mid-'90s, about where we were in the mid-'80s. So in some ways, sort of decades worth of stagnation. But that 15% overall poverty rate tells us 46 million Americans were below the official cutoff, about $23,000 a year for a family of four. Now, that rate was 22% for children, right? So almost 1 in 5 American children is living below that official poverty line. By contrast, the official rate for people over the age of 65 is 9%, very nearly half what the official poverty rate is. And while there are a number of different pieces to that explanation, the biggest one is Social Security, right? How have we managed, starting from the 1950s, when poverty rate among the elderly was higher than any other demographic group, to the point today where it's lower than any other demographic group? We have lowered poverty among the elderly by sending them money on a regular basis. I mean, at some level, it really is just that simple. Right, of course, it's not that simple. It's an extraordinarily complicated kind of thing. But at one level, if you want to reduce poverty, that's easy. Start cutting people checks. So that's what I mean by it's not a policy problem. There are all sorts of other countries we could look toward for lessons in how we might lower poverty in the United States. There are also, by extension, all kinds of different programs in the contemporary period and in the past that we could look to that have given us lower poverty rates, either in other periods of time or among certain groups of Americans. So if that's not the problem, right, if we know how to do it, then for me it's a political problem, right? It's that if the solutions exist, if the technical solutions exist, then it is a political problem, right? It's a lack of power, it's a lack of will, it's a lack of consensus, it's a lack of motivation, it's a lack of other kinds of things where I think we should be looking to try to explain poverty in the U.S.
You're listening to Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck. Our special guest this segment, Stephen Pimpare. He is an associate professor of social work at Columbia University and the City University of New York. He's the author of A People's History of Poverty in America. He has worked extensively in this area. Stephen, as we talk about this subject, and again, I know that you are trying to avoid being political here, and which we certainly respect, but I'm curious, just as your research, is there necessarily a relationship between administrations that are in power, poverty levels in America, quality of life levels of America, however those, and you measure those, or is it more just a matter of just whether they're just coincidental timing?
Well, that's complicated by the fact that we only have the current poverty data that we use from about 1959 forward. So everything prior to 1959 is guesswork at best. So I'm just going to set that aside for the moment. What we see, however, is that in the post-war period, we see poverty declining, starting in the Eisenhower years, a Republican, pretty steadily across all groups of the population, from Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson to Nixon. And we, in fact, reached the lowest poverty rate we've ever achieved by official measures, 11.1% in 1973. And that number then starts to escalate, first under Carter, a Democrat, and then much more quickly under Reagan. We get to the 90s, and largely as a consequence of a booming economy, some expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit, which we have to give initially Ford credit for, but the expansion happened under Clinton. But, he was building on some of the work that Reagan did. We get about 11.3% in the late 90s, so we actually start to get very close back to that 1970s number, and then starts to turn around again under the George W. Bush administration, and has remained essentially flat under the Obama administration. So I think that there are any number of different stories that we might want to tell about what the political party of the president has to play there. I think it's important that we keep in mind that, of course, the president is not the only actor in this process, and that we have to think about what's going on in terms of congressional action and how that plays out. And it plays out in some sort of funny, unexpected ways. I mean, it's become fashionable even among certain historians to look back on the Nixon administration and to look at domestic policy under Nixon and identify him as a liberal and someone who would be radically to the left, arguably not only of today's Republican Party, but even to the mainstream of the Democratic Party. What that misses is that while there were a lot of what we would identify as liberal policies that were enacted during the Nixon administration, a lot of that was a consequence of him seeing the Democratic Congress getting in front of policies that were likely to pass anyway and trying to get some credit for them. So he was sort of aligning himself with a lot of what I would identify as really good policies, right? Things like indexing Social Security to inflation so that it automatically goes up every year if the cost of living goes up. He did that for strategic reasons, not because he necessarily cared about the well-being of old people. That having been said, I'll take it, right? I mean, good policy is good policy. But I think when all is said and done, the story is sort of messy in terms of how the partisan alignment plays out.
What about just in general? And again, we understand that Americans elect their politicians, so you could point to them, so to speak. But overall, right now, what in the year 2013, what do you believe the average American, typical American, however you want to say, its attitude towards poverty in America? Is it different than it was 10 years ago? The same? Is it more compassionate? Is it less? Tell us overall.
It's a great question. It's a really hard one to answer, in part because we've got all sorts of really good and really useful survey data on these kinds of questions, but it depends so much on how it is that you ask those questions. The results wind up being really all over the place. I think in part because not only historically, but especially sort of post 1970s, 1980s, we've demonized all kinds of images of very particular kinds of poor people, right? This is the rise of the welfare queen. So we've got all kinds of political strategies, right, to identify enemies around poor and low-income people, and often sort of strategically identifying them as people of color, right? This is part of what we historically referred to as the Southern strategy. All of that stuff winds up making Americans thinking on these kinds of questions really, really muddy and really, really changeable. Here are a couple of things that are constant, however. If you ask Americans if we should spend more money on ensuring that children are taken care of or that children are not hungry, overwhelming majorities consistently always say yes. When you start turning to groups of adults, you start getting messier kinds of responses. There's also a real difference depending on whether you ask people whether we should spend more money to reduce poverty. There's a great sort of irony is not quite the right word, but sort of historical fact that if you ask people if we should spend more money on cash assistance programs to families with children to reduce poverty, majorities consistently say yes. If, by contrast, you ask, should we spend more money on our cash welfare programs, large majorities consistently say no. Now, of course, our traditional cash welfare programs are precisely cash benefits that go to families with children, but the idea of welfare has become so loaded that it gets in the way. Right. And the other thing that we know is that you look at, particularly over the recent period, consistent majorities identify inequality as having gotten too high. Consistent majorities feel as if they're working harder and harder for less and less. Consistent majorities feel as if the political system is not responding to their needs. And we've got much sort of broader measures of dissatisfaction. Popular approval of Congress, never especially high, is as low as it has ever been measured in all of the time that we've been conducting such measures. I mean, literally lice rank higher than opinions of Congress in a recent survey.
What about, let's throw this one into the mix as well. Curious as to your take on the American attitude about legal, illegal aliens, however you wish to refer to them as, this new set of population, particularly in recent years, and how does that change our attitude towards poverty and or helping our fellow American or fellow non-Americans?
I think sort of talking about undocumented workers, whether that as rather than sort of human beings as illegal is.
Correct.
I think decent, and also what sort of folks have expressed themselves as wanting to be referred to, and I think all else equal, if we can do that, we should. Immigration, is really messy and has historically wound up dividing the parties, because it winds up splitting the Democrats and it winds up splitting the Republicans, and then you get sort of funny kinds of coalitions, right? I mean, Democrats have always been ambivalent about immigration. On the one hand, and the modern Democratic Party sort of has the an identity of being open and inclusive, but it also has tried to form an identity as looking out for working people. And because of basic principles of supply and demand, the more people who come into the country in order to compete for jobs, all else equal, that really will drive down wages. Right, so that's always split the Democratic Party, and you wind up with a similar kind of dynamic happening on the Republican Party, in which it's its nativist wing, right, that wants to close the borders and exclude all kinds of people who do not sort of fit their ideas about what traditional Americans ought to look like, against the more sort of business funded and business supportive wing that has historically always welcomed greater numbers of immigrants for precisely the same reasons that other group of Democrats doesn't like it, right? The more you have of something, the cheaper it is. If you have a very open immigration policy, again, all else equal, you're going to wind up driving down wages. I think this is part of the complexity, and has always been part of the complexity of lawmaking around immigration in the United States. It's playing out today in an even more complicated kind of way, in part because that nativist wing of the party seems to be in control in the House, and arguably that sort of more business-friendly wing of the Republican Party seems to be in control in the Senate, which is why you've got this sort of impasse, and it's really unclear whether we're going to wind up anything coming out the other end.
The chasm between the haves and the have-nots in the country, it's well documented, growing all the time. The apparent political chasm between those in Congress is growing all the time. If this is, in fact, a political problem, or certainly a political issue, what in the world can we expect for any kind of a solution, or at least even a reasonable attempt at one?
Right. So how do I fix things and make everything all better?
Yeah. What can we fix it over the course of this show?
Sure. Plenty of time. I think that there are lots of moving pieces to this. And I don't know that I've got anything particularly novel to offer, but maybe I can sort of put some of the pieces together. I think one of the pieces of this is absolutely the reality that the American political system is awash in money in a way that other political systems are not. And there's a growing body of evidence documenting the effects of that. It's not, it's distorting the political system even more than historically money always has. There's one sort of sophisticated analysis of this by a guy called Martin Gillens and another by Larry Bartels, both trying to get at this question of are there certain groups that Congress is more responsive to than to others? And they looked at it by income. And what they've both found in different kinds of ways is that the larger the percentage of wealthy Americans who support a particular kind of policy change, the more likely it is that Congress is going to enact that change. So in that sense, Congress is perfectly responsive, right? There's good democratic responsiveness in Congress when it comes to wealthier Americans. However, if we look not just at poor Americans, low-income Americans, working-class Americans, but even at middle-class Americans, we look at that entire set of groups, the larger the percentage of lower-income Americans who support a particular kind of policy change has no effect whatsoever on whether Congress is in fact likely to enact a law. So they are utterly unresponsive to the needs of not just the most marginalized Americans, but a growing and growing segment of the population. That's money in politics. That's the growing percentage of millionaires themselves who are in politics. It's arguably sort of the redistricting effects that allow members of Congress to respond only to a very narrow segment of their own constituency and ignore broader kinds of needs. All of that, I think, is in play in powerful kinds of ways. I think we also, however, have to turn around and look at voters themselves, right? I mean, if you think about the 2012 election, give or take, about a third voted Democratic, about a third voted Republican, and about a third didn't vote at all. And that's fairly consistent, although it fluctuates up and down, but this has been a longstanding problem. About a third of the eligible American electorate does not participate, and those folks who don't participate are, in fact, more likely to be lower income, less educated Americans, the very people whose interests are not being represented at one level. Well, that makes sense, right? I mean, if you're a member of Congress and you're thinking about your next election, right? It's coming up in 2 years or it's coming up in 6 years, whether you're in the House or the Senate, right? You need two things. You need money to run your next campaign and you need votes. Well, you can't turn to poor people for contributions to your campaign. They turn out to be terrible contributors. But also you can't rely upon them for votes because they are much less likely to show up and vote. So at one sort of rational level, from the perspective of a lawmaker, why should they bother? Why should they pay attention to those potential constituents' needs if there's nothing to be gained from them and no threat that they pose? One last piece, I mean, we could add, a dozen pieces to the puzzle, but one last piece that I think also winds up being really important is declining rates of unionization in the United States. I mean, if we look around the world and throughout the entire post-year period, the single best predictor of how broad and generous any given country's welfare state will wind up being is the strength of their labor party. We don't even have a labor party, right? I mean, this is sort of one of the anomalies of the American political system. We don't even have a labor party, and we've always had a much lower share of our labor force unionized, but that's been in radical decline since the really late 1940s, early 1950s, right? We've gone from a third of the labor force being unionized in the 50s to about 11% today. And most of that is increasingly concentrated in the public sphere, and that's in decline as well. That matters, right? Because that's a way that working people can sort of push back in an institutionalized kind of way against some of those larger interests. As that fades, as they're not participating as voters, as they're not participating as campaign contributors, there are fewer ways to be heard and to exert leverage.
Well, it is a fascinating subject. It is one that has been talked about for decades and, like it or not, most likely talked about for decades to come, and that is the general subject of poverty in America. Our guest this segment has been Dr. Stephen Pimpare. He is an associate professor of social work at Columbia University, City University of New York, has spoken and written on this subject extensively. The most recent work, A People's History of Poverty in America. Stephen, how can people find out more about the work that you do, and in particular, this most recent People's History?
Probably easiest just to Google me. You'll find the book on Amazon. You can also find me on Twitter at Stephen Pimpare. Which is also, if you're interested in sort of domestic policy stuff, I tend mostly to focus on that, so it might be a good source for general information.
Well, listen, I very much appreciate your time and your insights, and very pleased you could share part of your day with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.